Great. So the first thing I'm going to do my Oprah thing, and all of you are going to get a copy of my book, thanks to Linda. You get one, you get one, you get one. So I'm happy to do this. Always great to come with gifts. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about one chapter in the book, and it's a significant chapter in the book. And it's about somewhat how I came to be, and it's related to my cradle to greatness. But in general, I study assets in majority black cities that are devalued. So many of the things that we are told are broken are actually, come to find out, they're not. And so my job is to provide people with the empirical evidence to show that there's nothing wrong with black people that ending racism can't solve. You can clap that up. We are fed a narrative that black people, brown people, poor people are broken, and that our programs, our initiatives are squared to fix them. But yes, we all need some fixing. I need some therapy. You need some therapy, right? But that's not the reason why we see the disparities. I'm going to start here, home, 1320 Hill Avenue, Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. It's a small municipality surrounded on three sides by Pittsburgh. It's about 70% black. That's my home. You can tell the roof is bowed, it's boarded up. And so I'm going to start here. It's told that when I was born, the woman who raised me, who was about 63 years old, went to McGee's Women's Hospital in Pittsburgh, and she went to see my mother, and she talked to her and said, hey, I'm going to take in your child and your older brother, and we're going to go back to 1320 Hill Avenue. It's unclear if I was supposed to stay for a short period of time or if it was all part of the plan for me to stay there. But I was informally adopted by this woman. She's on the far upper right corner, and her daughter also helped raise me on the far upper left corner. As you can see, I wasn't the only one. My brother and I weren't the only ones who would live with her. She eventually informally adopted about 12 to 15 other children. Some stayed for 6 weeks. Others, like myself, stayed from the cradle to I graduated from high school. There's a reason for that. This handsome young gent is my father. Now, all throughout me growing up, I knew that he got into trouble. I also knew that he was murdered in jail, which was true. I did not necessarily know the story because for all intents and purposes, this was my family. I recognized the woman who raised me as my mother, my biological mother. She lived about a few miles away. She came by during Christmas, holidays, things like that. She would drop off some change to support the family on occasion. But for the most part, this was my family. I didn't get engaged in my biological family for the most part. But it was told to me that he was murdered in jail breaking up a fight. Now, I didn't believe that because, I didn't think you became a humanitarian at the time in jail. So there was something that just didn't add up, right? But I did hear that he hurt people. He was abusive to my mother. He was abusive to, I have other siblings. He was abusive to them as well. But the reality is, in the research for this book, I did find out he was a drug addict. And he was a good person. But the narrative I heard not only from my family, actually my family tried to put a good face on this story, which I'll get into in a second. But the narrative was he was a bad person. There was also a narrative when I went off to college, went to a small liberal arts school in Meadville, Pennsylvania, Allegheny College. And one of my first things I read was the Moynihan Report. Now, if you are familiar with the Moynihan Report, it certainly had a structural analysis of poverty, but it provided a template for moving forward that said black women's marriage practices were the cause of poverty, right? So for me, not only my biological mother and this woman right here, she was married, but she lived with somebody who died when I was about 7 years old. But they were assumed to put me in harm's way. Now, early on in college, I knew that could not be true. It was impossible. When you're growing up in a place like Pittsburgh, and I was born in 1970, around the time the steel mill industry started to collapse, I could see why, from an economic perspective, why all these kids ended up at 1320 Hill Avenue. People were out of work, and as you know, it is said when white people catch a cold, black people catch pneumonia. Unemployment rate at the time was about 20%, which generally means black unemployment was about 40%. But you see black and white children in this house staying for different durations because of the environment. We needed someone to do this work, right? So for me, it never sat well that this woman was putting me in harm's way, making me poor. So I went back to that home at 1320 Hill Avenue, and I started investigating this home. It's boarded up. I wanted to see its value. Essentially, the city has taken it over. It's essentially worth $0. But I wanted to get at it. It should be worth more than that. That this woman who raised all these children, it should have a higher value. I know it has a higher value. So I started exploring. And I started comparing home prices in majority black neighborhoods where the share of the black population is greater than 50%. And I compared those to white neighborhoods, essentially, where the share of the black population is less than 1%. And if you can look on the left side of the diagram, you see where blacks is less than 1%, and homes are worth, in general, about $340,000. As the percentage of black people in a community increases, the prices drop. Black homes in black neighborhoods are priced at about half of what it is in white neighborhoods. But as you can understand, most people generally think, I understand why that's the case. And what are some of the reasons why you think that the home prices are lower? Yep, right off the top, everybody says schools. What else? Crime. Segregation, all those different things. But these are things you can measure, right? I can actually control, from a statistical standpoint, crime, education, walkability, all sorts of things. We'll get into it. So that's what I did. I wanted to get it to an apples-to-apples comparison. So I took that absolute price, what you saw earlier. Then I looked at the structural characteristics. I looked at the number of rooms, the size, the quality. We used Zillow so we could actually get a sense of the quality of the home. Then I measured neighborhood characteristics, everything from crime, education, number of restaurants, number of gas stations, all those neighborhood characteristics. I just put this up here. It's probably hard for you to see, but I'll just say this. There are a lot of great things in the hood that in black neighborhoods, they're more walkable. There's better transportation. In many cases, the housing stock is wonderful, right? The test scores are lower in black neighborhoods. Commute times are about the same. Number of restaurants are about what and what. Black neighborhoods have a lot going on. There's a lot of good in black neighborhoods. But after controlling for all of those issues, what we found that homes in black neighborhoods are worth 23% less, about $48,000 less than its equivalent in a white neighborhood. So what I'm saying is, if I took this black home in a black neighborhood and helicoptered it over to a white neighborhood, it will increase in value by 23% immediately. Immediately. It's about $156 billion in cumulative losses. Now, I'm not talking about over time. I'm talking about these data are from 2017. So right now, this is what's happening. And it's happening all across the United States where there's enough black people to measure and we can find essentially peers. So wherever you see a magenta circle, that's where you see devaluation. The bigger the circle, the greater the devaluation. All throughout the United States. The green circles are places where homes in black neighborhoods are actually worth more than those in white neighborhoods. There are places where that actually happens, but you can all clearly see there's a trend. There's a trend. In the D.C. area, homes are worth about 15% less, about 48,000 less, but the equivalent home. And this is easy to see. Ask anybody from PG County what their home value is. They can drive right across the river and see the almost same exact home and say, why is my home worth that much less? Just to give you a listing of things. Lynchburg, Virginia, homes are worth 81% less in black neighborhoods. The equivalent home. The equivalent home. Rochester, 65%. Detroit, 37%. I mentioned Washington, D.C. Metro. There are places where homes are appreciating in black neighborhoods. Nashville, Wichita, Boston. Now, and everyone always asks me this. No, Boston is no less racist or more than Rochester, New York, right? I'll just give you, I know Skip Gates is coming on, but in general, when the bougie black class are concentrated in the same area around poor whites, you generally get that kind of effect, right? So that's probably the case in Boston, but we see it in other places as well. This is hard. I just want to bring this up. It's hard to decipher here, but wherever there's devaluation, there's lower economic mobility. So we overlaid our data with Raj Chetty's work on economic mobility, and we found that homes in black neighborhoods where there's devaluation, people who lived in those from that period in which Raj Chetty explored earned less money, were less economically mobile, right? So it has an impact on our livelihood. Now, the reason why I brought this up, and it's something that I want you to consider, I need for you to consider. I want to put this in perspective. $156 billion. What is it? It would have paid for 4.4 million black-owned businesses based on the average amount of black startups. It would have funded 8.1 million four-year degrees. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint 3,000 times over. It would have funded all of Hurricane Katrina damage. And I should acknowledge this. The reason why I brought my father up is because he was a heroin addict. And it would have paid for, in today's terms, more than double what it costs us for the opioid crisis. Right? There is nothing wrong with black people that ending racism can't solve. When we're doing our work in communities, if you're not asking about why these things are happening, not because your grandma did that or daddy was absent and all this other stuff. If your work isn't somehow going upstream and asking deeper questions, again, I will never excuse the behavior my father exhibited on my mother, on others. But at the same time, I also acknowledge his story is part of my story. That the wealth that was extracted from wherever he lived impacted his life. That $156 billion should have gone to public schools, should have gone to infrastructure, should have gone to his college education. And yet structurally, this is happening. We're not talking about redlining in the past. Certainly, we see the ghost of it in today's policy. This is today. It's in our appraisals. It's in our real estate behavior. It's in our lending practices. It's also in the behavior of the President of the United States when he says, look at these rat-infested, crime-infested areas. That's devaluation, right? That's devaluation. When we're looking at our assets, and they are pieces of strength. In the book, I go through family, I go through housing, I go through education. There are inanimate objects, there are people, there are firms that are worthy of investment. The problem with any kind of deficit frame, you never invest in deficits. You don't invest in deficits. You're not giving your money to things that are broken. But in the black community, we constantly give money to other people to fix the black community. You see this in education. Education is littered with white saviors, right? To fix. Nothing grows without investment. Nothing grows without investment. One of my favorite quotes, and I need to get the name right, Thich Khan, the Vietnamese philosopher. Yeah, there you go. I'm going to say it. There you go. One of my favorite quotes is when he's talking about don't blame the lettuce. When lettuce when you're growing lettuce is not growing, you don't blame the lettuce. You look to see if it's getting water, sunlight. You see if there's some type of rodent coming to eat it, birds eating the seeds. You never blame the lettuce. But yet when black and brown children aren't growing, guess what we're doing? We're blaming the lettuce. In our schools, if there's performance not being rescued, we don't look why. We start blaming teachers. We fire teachers. We remove legislative authority. We do everything we do to black people, we do to black institutions. We're constantly treating black school boards, black cities, black infrastructure like black people, which isn't good in that regard, right? So part of my research is about just giving people information. One of my favorite artists, I just saw him this week with Robert Glasper, Most Deaf. He said, then in the song, Fear Not a Man, then how do people get better? Well, people, from my understanding, people get better when they understand that they are valuable, right? The reason why I titled my book, Know Your Price, my favorite play in the entire world is 2 Trains Running by August Wilson. If you don't know that play, go see it. If you don't know August Wilson, get to know August Wilson, right? But in the play, the main character, Memphis, is about to have his business seized through eminent domain by the city of Pittsburgh that was building at the time. The reason why I lived in Wilkinsburg is because this is an actual event. The city of Pittsburgh was going to build the Civic Arena in the Hill District, in a black area of town. it pushed all the black people out, but so they seized property through eminent domain all throughout the area. And this happened in Detroit, Memphis, wherever there were black people lived, this was happening. But they offered him $15,000 for his business. The main character, Memphis, goes back, says, I'm not selling my business for $15,000. And I'm paraphrasing, I know my price. And throughout the play, I know my price. I'm not selling, and the offers keep going up. There's another character, Hambone, who paints a fence for a proprietor for a ham. And he paints the fence, he never gets his ham. He goes back and forth with the proprietor, give me my ham, give me my ham. Throughout the play, it's the refrain. He never gets his ham. And we're not sure if he was mentally ill or unstable before, but he certainly died gone mad. Now, there's actually a happy ending to the story. The main character, Memphis, gets $35,000, $20,000 more than what he was originally offered. Now, the moral of the story should be clear. One, you got to know you have value. Our families are constantly told that what they have is not of value, that they are not of value. We constantly have to give them information that shows, no, they are devalued. And our efforts have to address those issues that are lessening their worth. No question. Now, the only part about the story I don't like, eventually the main character sells his property. He did so by choice, but we have communities all over the country. One, in terms of property, they are being pushed out. But it's not just about property. It's about our schools. It's about our infrastructure. It's about our leadership. You know how many black mayors don't get the investment they need to be successful? This is what my book is about, but this is about what I'm hoping you will do with the investments that you get. Do not devalue people. Instead, invest in strength. And that is my presentation today, right? So at this time, we're actually going to take a few questions. I've studied a couple of other issues besides housing, but I'm free to open this up to any question that you may have. Yes.
Hi, I'm Karen Alston from Eagle Academy. I love how you started your remarks with real estate. I live here in Washington, D.C., and I'm watching my real estate rise, of course, because the opposite is happening. My question is, you talked about the things you can measure. How do we push back on these immeasurable things that happen? So, yes, you can talk about test scores and shopping and walkability and all those other things and how we show our value, but how do we start to measure the things that aren't, quote unquote, the normal facts that people look at in talking about what value is and how they place worth?
Well, being in D.C., there was a great example that I actually write about, actually in the book as well. If you're familiar with the go-go scene here, you know that go-go is under attack, which means black people are under attack. There was a store, Metro PCS, a phone store, and it's changed carrier over time, but the owner has consistently played go-go music outside this store. It's an asset, right? That it has survived more than 20-something years, probably because it played the music. Eventually, in over 20-something years, if you live in D.C., you know that it's developing rapidly. They built an apartment complex across the street from the store. Largely white residents, mostly white residents, started complaining. that the music was a nuisance. After 20 years, no complaints. Decibel levels at allowable levels. No complaints for 20 years. They build up an apartment complex filled with whites. They start complaining. Now, what was interesting, they didn't get a response from the owner. The owner complained until they went corporate. They called the corporate head, Laguerre. I always pronounce his, what's that? Jonathan Laguerre. And he tells the store owner to cut it off. He does. Guess what happens? The cultural asset, that is hard to measure. The cultural asset emerged. A young student from Howard developed the hashtag, and it was brilliant, "Don't Mute DC." It became a rallying cry. Don't mute DC. People gather, and I was at one of those rallies people, there was one on 14th and U, there was other place near the store. Folks rallied behind the music, the culture. Now that's hard to measure, but we know it's real. People don't come to places like DC without culture, right? But it's the point that when you have to live next to black people, that's the issue. We're constantly trying to commodify black culture, brown culture, right? I lived in New Orleans for 14 years. You can clap that up. Where you want to limit and restrict black culture to Bourbon Street. But when it comes to living next to black people, then it becomes another issue. But don't get it twisted. There are economic developers who artificially paint murals on walls. You see that all over the place as a way to show that there's culture. Woo, you got a mural of Paul Robeson. Oh, goodness, it's hot. I'm moving there. No black people, right? But the point is, you're right. There's some things we can measure. It's easier to measure. But I also know that we all know that there are assets that we have, and we have got to use at times when they're trying to push us out. This is a continuation of the story. If you know about DC, you also know about the story about people walking on Howard's campus to have their dogs relieve themselves. Now, there's always been town and gown relationships, relationships in here in DC. Folks in Howard have always had issues with folks, but this was a little different. People are so comfortable devaluing black people, they'll say, "Oh, I'll have my dog relieve himself or herself on the lawn." Where culture, I don't have to explain. It is the Mecca. You will not deface the Mecca. And we have got to, know your price when it comes to that. But the point is, yes, there are assets that are harder to measure, but we have got to fight for them. You might need them.
So what was going on in the communities in which the black valuation was actually higher than the white valuation? What are the
what's interesting, though, there are a few cities that, Nashville, for instance, and I wherever I saw the green dot, I did a little investigating. Some of it, like in Florida, it's probably noise because data noise because of the number of retirement communities, and it's throwing things off. But there are a few cities, Nashville, when you look at income inequality, it's actually shrinking, right? And it's showing benefits for the black community. The lower income blacks is not as robust as you would like to see. Because you go across the state, you got Memphis is a whole different ballgame, right? But there are places that I have to say it's hard to go in on them to say, what are you doing? And so whenever you're seeing employers who are hiring people at a decent clip and paying people, and you see folks with, in general, government jobs with good benefits, you see these kind of impacts on housing. Now, Nashville's interesting because you have Meharry, you have Fifth, you have all these different things that are sort of protecting outcomes there. And I have another study that looks at HBCUs, and that's another place where there's a layer of protection. It's not as solid as we would like, but living in a college town has its benefits.
Good afternoon. I'm Cassandra Edwards, and I'm with Segis Institute. Can you touch on internalized racial oppression?
Oh, yep.
As
Now,
it applies to our communities in general?
Now, and I knew that was coming, the one reason I have to say that, the reason why I stay on this, there's nothing wrong with black people that ending racism can't solve, is because we're constantly looking at what's wrong with people. And we have there's enough people out there who provide negative commentary on black and brown people, what we're not doing. The reality is, the same way the woman who raised me did not put me in harm's way is the same thing that's happening to black and brown children. They're not, if you think that our belt-wearing strategies and whether or not we have haircuts are the reasons why we don't get into college, then you're kidding yourself. But we still today have legislation. The misinformed brother down in Memphis, the principal in Texas, having dress codes for parents. And what's silly about that, what's absolutely silly about that, my son goes to Ross Elementary here in DC. It's a zone public school, but it's in DuPont Circle. I live in DuPont Circle. The parents come to school in yoga pants, whatever. There's no dress code. There's no dress code. You know, so for me, go upstream. Yes, there's violence in our communities. Yes, there's a lot of things negative. Let's keep the focus on policy violence. The reason why you see that devaluation right there is policy. Federal, state, local. Violence. Federal policies kill hundreds times more than any kind of gun violence ever. Diabetes, health issues, a direct result of policy. So yes, I mean, if you want a sort of a psychological profile, get psychologists, whoever, to talk about those things. I'm a policy person. I'm going to stay on policy. But I think that's the right frame for us. I think I got one more question.
Hi, I'm Amber Coleman-Mortley with iCivics, and you actually started to talk a little bit about Black civic participation.
Yeah.
And so if you could expound on that point, like the need, the necessity, the role of Black civic participation in preserving our community and our community values.
Yep. The reason why I named the book, again, Know Your Price, because this is also about challenging my institution, right? Too often, we give information to world leaders, governors, mayors, economic development leaders, the muckety-mucks, right? And there's some good muckety-mucks, Robert Smith's a good muckety-muck. We'll give him some data, reams and reams of data to make critical decisions. Communities need that's the same information. There are companies that provide the same information to developers that I'm providing you today. And communities don't see it. We need to give information to people so that they can act in the manner that my grandmother, that my mother helped me. You give people information, they will respond affirmatively. What's interesting about my project is that I put out a couple reports I mean, I'm seriously overwhelmed. I can't get to enough neighborhood meetings. I mean, I get called, daily to visit Flint, Michigan, or who's on my, Gary, Indiana called me today, right? And it's mayors and neighborhood associations. They're thirsty for data and information. It's incumbent upon us, this class of people, to deliver that data. Because I'm glad you asked that question. Your work should help people mobilize. I know that a lot of you are in the nonprofit sector, and you don't explicitly you shouldn't have a political aim. However, if you don't maximize the social capital in your neighborhoods, then you're missing the point, right? The folks can help solve the deeper problem. It's not going to be solved with Brookings. And I'm going to say that, right? Because I mean that. It's not going to be solved. We're getting more information. We have better data than we have ever had before. Wage stagnation, economic divergence by race in rural and between rural and urban communities. In so many ways, we're seeing growth at exceptional levels, yet the day-to-day lives of people are getting worse. Some of us are part of that problem. So the civics piece is so important. If we're not getting information so mobilized, then we're missing the point. We're missing the story of Memphis, right? We're not exacting the demands we need to get the change we need. Well, I'm all hot now. You got me hyped. I'm ready to go. But I want to thank Linda and all the folks here for doing the great work. But thank you for having me.
I'm astounded that I just met you and I am just in love. I just need to tell you.
Thank you.
You will be visiting a whole lot of places going forward. Would you all agree?
Yeah.
Oh my God. My brain is just popping. I'm thinking opportunity zones. Everybody thinks they know it. I think we need to overlay this, right? I'm thinking about what you're talking about because we have people in specific cities, but how can we make it scalable? How can, in other words, this information is almost what I've been dreaming to get, and it will certainly inform Cradle to Greatness, don't you think?
Yeah.
Don't you think?
And can I follow up? What you all are supposed to do, I know when you're in this position, you're thinking individually, you think about your organization. Think about how we can all connect. There's power here, but you don't get it if you don't really build the bridges between your sectors. It's important. It's important.
In the Black Panther Party, we had a saying, no information, no right to speak.
That's right.
We got some information today. Start speaking. Start sharing. Right? Deal? Thank Andre. I swear that was, I'm touched. Thank you. Thank you so much. Right. And you all are all getting his book.
Yep.
And a whole bunch of other books too, because you're going to get smarter and smarter. Thank you.
I agree.
All right.